Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Daniel Phipps and I am the Coal Seam Gas Project Leader with AgForce Projects. I'd like to welcome you this afternoon to another webinar from AgForce Projects, CSG and Mining Project. Firstly, I'd like to say thank you for giving me your time this afternoon and listening to the webinar. I will do my best to stay on time. The topic we'll be focusing on this afternoon is on the approved 2016 Surat Basin Underground Water and Impact Report as developed by the Office of Groundwater Impact Assessment and what that means for landholders. Before we do start the webinar, just a few housekeeping items. This webinar is listen-only mode, but at any point during the webinar, if you have any questions or comments or feedback about the process or your experience, please feel free to type these into the message box, which is located in the bottom left of your screen. Please also feel free to ask questions at any point throughout the webinar or at the end. Please also feel free to contact me after the webinar this afternoon to share your experience with the model, the groundwater process or the Make Good framework, or to raise any concerns that you have. My contact details will be emailed along with a recording of this webinar in the coming days. Alternatively, please call the AgForce office on 3236 3100 or email me at csg@agforceprojects.org.au. Just a reminder that this webinar is being recorded and that we will be sending a recorded version of this webinar as well as some supporting information such as follow-up answers to any question that has been registered. So if you're unable to listen to the webinar till the end of today, you will be able to access this recording later on. If you are having any technical problems or difficulties during the webinar, please feel free to type these into the message box on the left-hand corner and you will be contacted by Redback Technical Support, or please feel free to call the technical support number which is provided in the message box. If you're having any problems with hearing the audio or the slides coming through, please call the 1-800 number and enter the code provided in the message box. When you registered for the webinar this afternoon, most of you provided an indication of what you expect to gain out of the webinar this afternoon, and I'm hopeful and confident that most of the questions will be answered throughout the presentation today. However, like I've said, if there are any questions that you'd like to raise outside of this topic relating to CSG or mining, or any particular concerns with the content of the webinar or the groundwater investigation or modelling process, please do feel free to contact myself at AgForce. Thank you all again for registering and listening today, and let's get started on the webinar. So just a quick introduction about AgForce Projects. So the Coal Seam Gas and Mining Project, which is funded in partnership with the Queensland State Government, the Queensland Resources Council, as well as APIA as the peak body for the coal seam gas industry. We run advanced negotiation support workshops for landholders dealing with any resource activity or coal seam gas, including coal seam gas and mining, as well as technical industry field days, which may focus on a specific topic, such as groundwater and biosecurity. We also do extensive engagement with agribusiness professionals and those working with landholders in the mining resources space, and we encourage those with any questions to contact me for information the project has learned over the last 5.5 years of the project. We also support landholders during property mapping workshops and are able to allow landholders to develop a comprehensive property plan to be used in the negotiations with resource companies. Other projects that we run are also a federally funded project, which is the Pest Animal Management and Chemical Accreditation Safety Workshop, as well as the Grazing BMP project. And anyone with any information or questions are encouraged to contact the AgForce Projects office for information. Just a reminder that this session does provide an overview of information, and it's critical that landholders involved in this process should not use this information in lieu of legal or other professional advice, and we strongly encourage that throughout the presentation and the process for landholders to contact those for information. Just for a bit of a setting the goalpost for this afternoon's presentation, for those of you who don't know, and some of you have indicated a fairly limited understanding of the industry, so we will be trying to cater to all information needs this afternoon. But firstly, coal seam gas, or CSG as we'll be referring to it, the extraction can involve pumping both water and gas to the surface. This process can result in direct or indirect impacts to both bores, and also aquifers. In the Surat Basin, which is the target area for the CSG industry in Queensland, there is a regional groundwater model which predicts the long and short-term impacts of the industry, and this is what will be the focus of the webinar this afternoon. As part of this process, companies are required to make good the impacts to boards from those activities, and we'll be covering that make good framework. We'll also be covering landholder experiences and what to be aware of from our experience in that process. And it's also important, I think we mentioned, that in our experience, running this project for the last almost 6 years, that many landholders remain unaware of their rights and as well are unaware of where to access information and support. And this webinar and the services that are provided for free as part of this project aim to do that, to support landholders and allow landholders to understand where they can access this information. To start with, we'll just go through a brief outline about the Great Artesian Basin in the Surat Basin in Queensland, obviously the target area for CSG. So what we've got in the Great Artesian Basin, or the GAB, is the Surat Basin, which is one of the many sedimentary basins that make up the Great Artesian Basin. Within the GAB, we have these aquifers, which are water-bearing strata, such as where you get your groundwater from, and this is where you may have your artesian or sub-artesian bores. Between aquifers, there are areas which are called aquitars, and these are areas that limit or exclude the movement of water and pressure between the different levels of the basin, and also limit the exchange of materials between those two areas. What we have in the GAB is some interaction between these different aquifers and aquitars. And when we look at the CSG industry, we're focusing on the Walloon coal measures, which is the target formation for the industry in Queensland. When we look at the process, as shown in the image, so in order to get that gas to the surface, a well must be drilled into the Walloon coal measures and extract both water and gas, as the Walloons are both contain gas and water, and is a heavily used aquifer across the region. Like we mentioned before, bringing that water and gas to the surface can have a direct impact on the Walloon coal measures, as well as bores that extract water from the Walloon coal measures. But what we've also seen from the 2012 and the 2016 groundwater models is that that extraction of gas and water from the Walloons can result in some pressure reduction or movement of water from aquifers above and below the Walloon coal measures. And this is what is creating issues for landholders in being able to access their water short and long term, as well as increasing some gas content in some bores, as we will address. What we provide here is a bit of an overview of the industry in Queensland and the 3 different areas that are mainly being targeted. In the blue, you can see the outline of the Surat Basin. In the green, you can see the outline of the Bowen Basin. And in pink, you can see the outline of the Galilee Basin, which is in Western Queensland. The black and the red dots represent individual CSG wells that have been drilled across the span of the industry. The black dots indicate CSG wells that were drilled or existed as of April 2011 when the project started, and the red dots signify CSG wells that have been drilled since April 2011 up until earlier this year. So we use this map to be able to show landholders and those working with landholders the extent of the development of the industry, the expansion of the industry over the last 5 or 6 years, as well as putting into context where the future industry development is likely to occur. When we look at the number of wells that have been drilled across the landscape, in 2011 when the project started, we had about or just under 2,000 production wells. So these are wells that have been classified as being production wells, producing gas or connected to start producing gas. Move forward until earlier this year, we had about 6,000 production wells that have been marked with the department. So what we've obviously seen in that 5-year period is a significant expansion and development and increase of the industry. But we also like to put this figure into context of where the industry may be heading into the future, and it's important to recognise that the predictions of the industry in terms of the peak number of wells to be drilled and operating is between 18,000 to 40,000 wells. And when we get into talking about the groundwater model, the model being based on production of about 18,000 CSG wells. So at the moment, as a figure of 6,000 odd production wells, we use this to remind landholders that there's still significant development in the industry yet to occur, and reinforce why it's important for landholders and communities and those working with landholders to remain aware of the industry and the development and footprint that it's likely to have for the duration of the industry for many years to come, and that it's an important issue for all those regions and AgForce to manage on behalf of their members. When we look at some of the information taken from the model that we'll be presenting this afternoon, obviously we've been showing that the industry has been growing quite rapidly since 2011, as many of you are aware. When we look at the numbers, as you can see in the figure, we had a rapid development in the number of wells that were drilled in 2011, really increasing up to, like I said, about 6,000 production wells. And when we look at the projected totals included in the groundwater model, you can see the number of wells rapidly increasing as the development occurs, and again signifying that this wells rapidly increasing as the development occurs, and again signifying that this is important for landholders to remain aware of the future direction of the industry, but also to put in context some of the potential impacts when we're talking about groundwater. When we look at water production, according to the model, in 2013, around 12,000 megalitres of water were produced per year, but what we've moved through until 2015 was the peak water production of about 65,000 megalitres per year. And according to the model, the industry is likely to peak water production at up to 110,000 megalitres per year when it reaches its peak production. So it's important to put this figure again into context when we're looking at groundwater impact, looking at the long-term impact of the industry, and the reason why it's important for landholders to put in place proactive monitoring and negotiate proactive monitoring as part of your agreements with the resource companies, and also to make informed decisions about developing make-good agreements and managing your water resources moving forward. When we look at some of the differences between the 2012 model, which we'll be talking about in a little bit, and the current model, what we've seen, and one of the questions that was asked when registering for the webinar was what are some of the key differences between the model in 2012 and the 2016 model. And as you can see in the figure on your screen, the yellow areas indicate where planned coal seam gas production is likely to occur, and where in blue, where currently production of areas of CSG are currently occurring. So what you can see in the left-hand map, which is obviously the 2012 model, is a significant reduction the 2016 model shows a significant reduction in the number of planned CSG tenures as part of the industry, which is also important for landholders to look at the potential impacts from activities on property, from looking at the expansion of the industry, but also when we talk about groundwater impacts as well, and looking at that increased development of the industry over the next 30 or 40 years. So the focus of this webinar this afternoon is obviously looking at groundwater management, and we want to look at, well, where do landholders start? So where do you go as a landholder? And that was one of the main questions that many of you asked when registering for the webinar, was where do you go as the first point of call? And this is what we'll be outlining. We'll also be presenting the findings and the predictions of the current 2016 Underground Water Impact Report. We'll look at what was included in that model and what was the process to determine those impacts, and then we'll progress into the Make Good framework. So what is the Make Good framework? As a landholder, or those advising landholders, what should you be aware of? What are some of the considerations to take into account? And what are some of the things that you can do as a landholder actively when we start talking about things like baseline assessments and bore monitoring, and really proactively managing things moving forwards? So as a landholder, there's a few points we recommend that you go to start. As we mentioned at the start of this webinar, there is a regional groundwater model, and that model predicts the short and long-term impacts on registered bores across the Surat Basin management area. What you're able to do, and like I said, we will be providing an emailed recording of this presentation, as well as all of these links in an email, which will allow you to access. And there's a bore search, which the department has has generated, which allows landholders with registered bores to actually log on to the portal and input your registered or your bore ID, and what it will come up with is a prediction about any impact that's been predicted to occur to your bore as part of the model. So really we recommend for landholders, this is the first point you should start. You should look to see if your bore has been identified in either the short or long-term affected area, and importantly recognising that this is only for registered bores. So if your bore is not registered, it will not be included in the model. Landholders and everybody are able to view the full underground water impact report on the Department of Natural Resources and Mines website, and the link has been provided there, and we'll email that to you following the webinar. You're able to download the full report, and you're also able to download a summary of the report showing the key findings, the long-term and immediately affected areas, as well as outlining as landholders what are the next steps that you should take. AgForce Projects also recommend that you access the Queensland Globe and use the CSG Globe to actually view the underground water impact report areas as well as the identified bores, and a link has been provided to you there. When we go through the presentation, I will be showing you examples of all of these different portals. I'll be showing you examples of what information you can extract from the bore portal. I'll also be showing you the model drawdown maps and the predicted impacts. And I'll also be showing you how you can get information from the CSG Globe to be able to use that in looking at your own property impacts. I've also provided my contact details to contact the CSG and mining team. And throughout the presentation this afternoon, I'll also be referring you often to the Coal Seam Gas Compliance Unit as part of the Department of Natural Resources and Mines, and the great work that they do in this space. So when we talk about groundwater management, we need to start back a few years, and we need to look at the declaration of the Surat Basin Cumulative Management Area, or the CMA, which was declared in 2010. So what the Surat Basin Cumulative Management Area does is it was declared as a result of the development and expansion of the CSG industry, and recognising the fact that there are multiple different companies operating in the same landscape, and that the potential groundwater impacts from their activities are likely to have an overlapping or a cumulative impact across the region. So what the government did was that it declared that this area be managed under a regional or cumulative model, and it makes sure that the boundary of this model goes 50 kilometres outside the nearest CSG tenure, and it also made sure that landholder rights that are on tenure or off tenure within the CMA are the same, and we'll be addressing that as we go through in the presentation. Like I mentioned before, the Coal Seam Gas Globe, which is part of the CSG, the Queensland Globe, allows you to view this information digitally and also interactively. What it allows you to do, as you can see on your screen, it allows you to download the cumulative management layer and allows you to look at the extent of that boundary. So as landholders, if you're unsure if your property is within that cumulative management area, the first point I recommend you do is look at the globe to find out the extent and the boundary of the management area, and make sure your property is within or without it, and it will give you some idea of the area that we're talking about. When we talk about groundwater management, it's important to understand some of these key points. And the first point that I raised before was about the declaration of that cumulative management area. And what that did was put in place the next step. And this was one of the questions asked when registering was, well, how has this model come about, and what does it mean, and what are the steps from here? So what happens from now? So in 2012, we had the first model, which was released by the Queensland Government. And what that required was this model be developed by the Office of Groundwater Impact Assessment, or OGIA, and it took all these different bits of groundwater data and hydrogeological data and geology and production expectations and estimates from CSG companies and the Queensland Government, and lots of different data sources, and it developed this regional and cumulative groundwater model. So like I said, we had a model released in 2012, and we've had the current model released in September this year. What the model does is it identifies two areas of impact. It identifies an immediately affected area, which are impacts to aquifers or bores that are likely to experience a drop beyond a trigger threshold within 3 years of the model being released, and a long-term affected area, which is impacts outside that 3-year period and any point into the future. Once the model has been finalised, which it has been in September this year, these recommendations and this model becomes legislative. And what it requires is that these immediately affected bores, so landholders with a bore that's been identified in the immediately affected area, are required to begin negotiations and conversations with the responsible resource company to develop a make-good agreement. And a make-good agreement we'll be covering in the next couple of slides. The other long-term affected area bores, which may also have been identified by the model, require that the company develop a make-good agreement to cover those impacts before they're likely to occur. And like it says, a new model is released every 3 years, following the original model released in 2012. And when we look at the current model and the previous model, it's important to understand a few key points before we discuss it. The first point that landholders need to understand, and this was a question that was raised by many of you when registering, was does it predict impacts to all bores? And the short answer is no. So the model only predicts impacts to those bores which are registered. So if you have a stock and domestic bore, for example, that is not registered, it simply means that the department or the government don't know where that bore sits, they don't know the characteristics about that bore, and therefore it has not been included in the regional model. So if you have an unregistered bore and you go into the bore search portal or the CSG Globe, you'll find that impacts won't be predicted because it is only for those registered bores. When we talk about the predictions of the model, and this was another question that was asked, the model is based on production of up to 18,000 production wells. So when we talk about the estimates for the industry being from 18 to 40,000 wells, obviously there's a great difference between a lower number of wells and a higher number of wells and the potential impact that may have to both aquifers and also individual bores. To address this question mark, OGIA included a high development scenario which was developed, and that was based on around 31,000 wells. And what that showed was an increase of 17% in the number of long-term affected bores. So these are bores impacted in the long term of the industry outside that 3-year period, as well as a 43% increase in the total amount of CSG water produced. So that CSG water is water that is produced as a byproduct or as a result of extracting that gas. And what this variability indicates to us, and really does solidify that point we raised earlier, is that it's important for landholders to continue to remain aware of how the industry is developing, to be aware of the future model predictions that are updated every 3 years, as well as an annual report being released every year. And important for landholders to look at, well, you know, now is the time that we should be looking at doing some groundwater monitoring and monitoring one of the most important or valuable assets on your property, obviously being your groundwater bore supply. So what I'd like to do now is actually look at the predictions from the model and talk about what has the model actually predicted. And a large number of you obviously raised this as one of the key reasons you registered this afternoon. So in the model, like I said, you have a short-term or immediately affected area, which is impacts within 3 years of that model, and a long-term affected area, which are impacts outside that 3-year period. So the model has indicated that 100 registered bores have been identified in that immediately affected area, which includes what they've called a carryover of 36 bores from the 2012 model. So these were 36 bores that, according to groundwater database information, did not have make-good agreements executed, so therefore they were carried over from the 2012 into the 2016 model. All of these bores are sourcing their water from the Walloon coal measures, and when we look at the long-term affected area, we're starting to see that interaction between the Walloon coal measures and extracting or lowering water levels or pressure or gas from that aquifer, and the impact that it may have on bores that sit above or below it. So now that the model has been approved by the Department of Environment and Heritage Protection Chief Executive, the model is put into place, and what that requires is that landholders should already have been approached by the company that holds the tenure over their property or the company responsible for their make-good agreement, and begin discussions or negotiations to look at carrying out a bore assessment, which is an investigation on of the bore, or go straight to developing a make-good agreement. And as we've indicated there, it's critically important that landholders are encouraged to seek legal advice and valuation and accountancy advice in any negotiations regarding the make good process. As I indicated before, this information is available on the coal seam gas globe and allows you to view this groundwater data. So logging onto the CSG globe, it allows you to look at the extent of the cumulative management area, but it also allows you to look at the extent or the drawdown, and these are the large coloured rings. They're the drawdown contours of the aquifer that it relates to. So on your screen you can see the black rings relate to the Walloon coal measures, the brown rings relate to the Springbok sandstone, and the golden rings relate to the precipice sandstone. And those large drawdown rings relate to the drawdown relating to that aquifer, and those individual small rings relate to the registered bores that have been identified as likely or potentially likely to experience an impact within that 3-year period. And what it allows you to do using the globe, it allows you to view into and zoom into any extent to look at both the drawdown across the region of that aquifer, and it also allows you to click on each individual registered bore to look at the potentially or the predicted impact that bore is likely to experience. And as you can see, moving from region to region, it has specific drawdown rings and the contours showing that, as well as the individual bores. And those familiar with the 2012 model will notice some difference in both the drawdown rings and the number of contour extent that has been included in this 2016 model. What's most important for the majority of landholders and industry and community is obviously looking at the long-term impacts of the industry and looking into the future. What's the long-term impacts to groundwater suppliers as a result of CSG? So the model predicts these long-term affected areas, and these are for aquifers or bores that are likely to experience an impact or exceed an impact beyond a trigger threshold any time into the future outside that initial 3-year period. And when we look at the long-term affected area, the model has identified 469 registered bores that have been identified in that long-term affected area. And as you can see, the model is indicating that these bores source their water from the Walloons, but also from the Springbok, precipice and the Hutton sandstone. So these are aquifers that sit above and below the Walloon coal measures, showing that due to the interconnectivity between the Walloon coal measures and these other aquifers, there's potentially likely to be some impact to those bores or to those aquifers as a result of lowering pressure within the Walloon coal measures. So the long-term affected area requires tenure holders to undertake a baseline of bore assessment within those areas, and if required, enter into a make-good agreement with the bore owner before those impacts occur or are likely to occur. And as we saw with the immediately affected area, you're able to use the coal seam gas globe to look at the extent of the long-term affected area. And with the long-term affected area, you're able to look at individual aquifers, so you can turn off all the layers that relate to all the aquifers and just turn on the aquifer layer that relates to the Hutton sandstone in blue, for example, or you can turn off everything else and just look at the Walloon coal measures or look at the precipice sandstone and so on. And that allows you to look at both the regional drawdown of those aquifers, but also looking at the individual bores via these small colour-coded rings that have been identified as being impacted. And as you move across the region, we can obviously see the large percentage of those are within the Walloon coal measures, so the target formation for the industry, but also that those impacts have been identified in other aquifers as part of the Surat Basin in the Great Artesian Basin. Using the CSG globe, and this is where we strongly recommend you start as landholders, is to look at the predictions of the globe, the model, and access the information that's available on the globe. By looking at this information, what you're able to do is to click on an individual bore. So for example, if this was your bore and your property, and it's a registered bore, you're able to click on that bore. It'll show you the registered number, the RN number of that bore, the formation that that bore taps into, as well as giving you an option to click a link which will take you to some more additional information. And when you follow that link, it may take a few minutes depending on your connection speed, but it will bring you across to that bore search portal. And this is that portal that I was talking about earlier in the presentation. You can either access this portal by using the Queensland Globe, or you can access this portal directly by logging onto the department website through the links that we have provided and just manually entering in your bore registration number. As you can see in this example, what it shows you is the bore ID or the bore number. It shows you the source formation, so the geological formation that the bore is accessing water from, and this is as it's been logged within the department. And one of the key things that's been realised as part of the investigation process by the companies and also by the Queensland Government is that there are a number of bores which have been logged incorrectly within different aquifers. So a bore may have originally been drilled in the 60s, 70s, 80s or 90s, or whatever time period it may have been drilled, and in some instances the information has been incorrectly logged where the bore actually sits. And that's quite important when we get to the short and long-term predicted impacts when we're looking at bores. So if a bore has been identified as being logged into the Walloon coal measures, for example, but upon doing a groundwater investigation or a bore assessment, the investigation confirms that the bore has actually been drilled into the Springbok sandstone, which does have patches of coal within it and some similarity to the Walloons. Then obviously that has a great impact about either the short or the long-term potential impact to that bore. So this is some of the stuff it's important to investigate and look at landholders. You know where your water is coming from. This is important information to cross-check with the department and update if necessary. Looking at the information, it also shows you the long-term or the short-term predicted impact in metres. So this example, this bore taps into the Springbok sandstone. According to the model, the long-term predicted impact to that bore is a drop of about 14 metres, and it also indicates which is the responsible company that's required to take ownership of that potential impact in that investigation. It also then provides you a description of impact that provides some information about what is the long-term affected area and what are the trigger thresholds that define that potential impact, and also the next steps that happen in the process. So this is where we should really start as landholders, looking at that bore portal or looking at the CSG Globe information. When we move through to the next process of actually looking at, well, what is make good and what is the process and what are companies required to do, this is where we'll spend the next bulk of the presentation. So like it says on your screen, a make good agreement is separate to a CCA. So that CCA is a conduct and compensation agreement. So that's a land access agreement between you and the resource company. So a make good agreement is separate to that agreement. So you may be required to negotiate a make good agreement with no coal seam gas activity on your property. And this was a question raised by some of you when you registered. Well, what happens if my bore is being impacted by CSG, but there's no wells on my property, but they're on the neighbour's property? Well, the answer is this: is that the companies are required to make good that impact, whether there is activity on your property or not. If that impact is a result of the coal seam gas activity and they're the company that's closest to or creating that impact, then they're responsible to develop that make good agreement. So a make good agreement refers to a company's obligation to make good, as the department calls it, where there is or where there's predicted to be impaired capacity of a bore due to CSG activities. And this was the other point that's important for landholders to understand, is that there's a common misconception that you're only entitled to a make good agreement if your bore is included within the model. The reality is, if the bore is experiencing an impact and that impact can be attributed to CSG activities, then you're entitled to a make good agreement, and that's important to understand as landholders. When we talk about these make good agreements are also made up of what the department calls make good measures. And these make good measures, for example, like they show you, may include deepening the bore depending on the impact, or drilling a new bore into another aquifer. some people accepting financial compensation in lieu of a water supply, lowering the pump or increasing the pump size or capacity, or providing surface water. And it's important that landholders understand that the Make Good framework is not a prescriptive process. It's not a process that says you must do X, Y, Z in terms of Make Good measures. It simply is a negotiation between you as the landholder and the resource company to develop either an alternative water supply or increase water supply somehow, or reach some other arrangement. So it's important to understand and address from the outset as a landholder, what are your expectations in terms of a Make Good agreement, what's available and how is that going to be achieved. And they're the main things we should consider when we move into these negotiations. Now there are some conditions, and I'll explore more about Make Good agreements next, when an agreement can be changed. And this was one of the key questions that some of you asked, was about what happens if a Make Good agreement becomes ineffective, or what happens if another method becomes more available. So in legislation it does define that a Make Good agreement can be changed where there's either a material change in circumstances or where the Make Good measures are ineffective. So maybe drilling a bore a little bit deeper to supply with that water, but the groundwater impacts are greater than were predicted or modelled, and therefore the impact is still being felt, or whether another effective or more efficient measure is available. And these are some of the things that we need to consider when we develop these Make Good agreements. Now, as landholders, some of the things we wanted to make you aware of is a few points that you should consider in this process. Now, like it says, depending on the conditions of your Make Good agreement, the agreement may bind successive owners of the property. So similarly with your conduct and compensation agreements, that agreement may bind future owners of the property. So it's important to consider, well, first of all, what are your future water needs as your property? What are you looking to do in terms of developing the property? What are your expectations for the development of the property moving forward? And if you choose a Make Good measure that may remove that possibility or that option, will that process affect the value of the property? Or as a prospective buyer coming in, would they view a cash compensation of payment as being a property incentive in lieu of a groundwater supply? Or as a prospective buyer, would you see it as a negative that a property has removed that groundwater supply and that cash injection has already been spent? Or can that cash injection be spent to improve property conditions? These are some of the things that you need to consider, and why it's critical that you do engage that appropriate advice to help you through that process. One of the most important things is certainly making sure that you include in your agreements monitoring the effectiveness of the Make Good agreement. So not just leaving the agreement as is and thinking that it all will work forever and a day, that it's important that you include a monitoring strategy to make sure the effectiveness of the agreement is being achieved, and make sure you have a clear pathway to see what happens if the agreement becomes ineffective or that the impacts are greater than were predicted. And this is important when we're looking at drilling new bores or deepening bores, and taking into account the long-term predicted impact of the industry, but also other things like regional development, groundwater allocations and other development processes across the region. As landholders, if you're considering negotiating a replacement bore into another aquifer, it's important to understand and address, well, how will that aquifer be accessed, and what information has been used to determine and confirm that this aquifer is available, and what are the keys to determine and confirm that this aquifer is available, and what are the characteristics of that aquifer, and making sure that that new water supply suits your current and future property requirements. As we've shown, it's also important to look at regional development. So are other new bores being drilled? And this is where you would look at the CSG globe. If there are a number of bores within your region that have been identified in the same aquifer, for example, and you know that they're all putting a replacement bore into the Huttons or into another aquifer, then looking at how is the process of those new water supplies being moved into another aquifer, how is that being taken into account? And is that increased usage potentially likely to have any impact on that groundwater supply? And looking at other things such as, will your existing infrastructure manage the new supply? So increased pumps or increased pressures, increased temperatures? How will some of these considerations be addressed in your agreement? One of the things we always advise landholders is that information and data are powerful tools, and baseline assessments form a really important starting point and are really important tools for landholders to use in your agreements. When you registered, many of you indicated or asked the question of who is responsible to pay for baseline assessments, or who is required to develop a monitoring regime for your bores. And the answer to that is a little bit tricky, which will be addressed a little bit later. But what we're encouraging you to do proactively as landholders is to negotiate a pre-activity baseline assessment as part of any land access agreement. So if you're negotiating an agreement with a company to develop or drill wells on your property, then we strongly encourage you as part of that access arrangement that you include and discuss and make a baseline assessment process as part of that agreement, as part of your access agreement. And like it says in the third point, that it's not just a once-off process, but this is an ongoing monitoring process. And building up a large supply or a larger amount of groundwater data is much more important and much more comprehensive and useful than having one baseline assessment. So one baseline assessment is great and is better than nothing, but having a comprehensive a comprehensive monitoring regime which includes multiple measurements per year does tell a much more compelling story than a one-off assessment, and it also will allow you or the experts that you use to be able to look at identifying some of the potential impact or changes that may be occurring. What are some of the external influences that may be creating that change, and is your bore trends or your aquifer trends any different from regional or local trends in terms of groundwater movements? And like we've said there, it's important to utilise the expert advice within the coal seam gas compliance unit, within their groundwater investigation team, and their team have decades of experience and incredibly knowledgeable groundwater experts, and we strongly encourage anyone with any questions to contact the CSG compliance unit to talk to the groundwater team for information, for support, and also to use their knowledge in this process. One of the other points we encourage landholders to consider is any licensing required or requirements for any replacement bores or moving into different aquifers. So looking at water resource plans and regulated great artesian management areas, it's important to understand are there requirements for licensing attached to that bore for a stock and domestic or a licensed supplier or allocated supplier. Who's responsible for maintaining that process and who's responsible for covering those costs? And obviously we're recommending to landholders that this is a discussion, an upfront discussion you have with the resource company to make sure that this is a cost that you're not personally covering, or that it's integrated and covered within the make-good agreement to make sure there's no out-of-pocket expenses you're felt. Like we mentioned before, when we're looking at replacement supplies, it's important to look at groundwater characteristics and how do these compare to your current supply. And things that you should consider might be temperature of the water. So will that require any cooling tanks? What are the salt and mineral content? What's the pH? What are the characteristics of that supply? How does that relate to preferences for stock watering? Or how does that relate to soil structure and the process of irrigation? And these are some of the things that, this is why it's important to engage that professional advice as part of developing these make-good agreements, and important that these are addressed. And like we've said, it's important to seek that advice not only regarding the make-good measures to confirm they're adequate, but also to look at the components of the baseline assessment, the frequency of monitoring, and what are some of the things that you can proactively do now before any potential impact occurs to sort of get your ducks in a row and start to get your process working. And there are some government changes that are occurring in this space that are looking at providing you with some increased rights as landholders. As a starting point, AgForce have developed a bore baseline assessment checklist, which we've developed in consultation with some leading groundwater experts, and it provides you with a bit of a reference point, a bit of a starting point to look at identifying what are your water requirements, what are your water uses, what are some of the characteristics of your bore, and start to look at some of this information that you can gather from your own knowledge or from your own records. And really important that we look at comparing this to some of the information that the department has and identifying any discrepancies, because some of those discrepancies in terms of the depth of the bore or the aquifer that's being accessed or the water supply characteristics may become quite critical when you get into identifying impacts or potential impacts or assigning responsibility for any impacts. And some of this information is very important. There's an excellent program that we strongly encourage landholders to get involved with, and it's called CSG Net. And CSG Net is a program that's offered by the CSG Compliance Unit through the Groundwater Investigation Team, and it's a brilliant project that actually allows landholders to work together and gives them the knowledge, the tools and equipment and the support to be able to monitor your own bores and also be able to use that information to maintain a bore record, a bore assessment record, and be able to use that information to fill in the gaps as part of a regional monitoring network. So, landholders really taking ownership of that bore assessment process and being able to fill in the gaps in that regional monitoring network so that we can get a better understanding of where those potential impacts or trends are occurring and use that to improve groundwater understanding and predictions across the region. One of the questions, like I said, that was asked before was looking at about who's required to carry out baseline assessments and at what stage of the process are companies required to do the baseline assessment. Now, it's important that as a landholder or those working with landholders, it's important to look at doing a bit of a risk assessment. And this is where tools such as the CSG Globe provide a great starting point to look at where are activities occurring. And the Globe not only has all the groundwater data, but it also has all the CSG activities. So it shows you where exploration tenures have been granted or under application. It also shows you production tenures, pipelines, and also shows you individual CSG wells. So if you look at the Globe, and some of you have indicated that you're quite outside the area of development within the Surat Basin, and you realise that the nearest gas well or development area is 100 kilometres away, then maybe the likelihood of impact is a lot less than if you look at the Globe and you realise that 5 kilometres down the road there's 100 gas wells that have been developed on a property, and obviously looking at maybe that creating a bit of an elevated risk. Like we've indicated, once a company has been granted an exploration permit, which is called an authority to prospect, once a company's been granted that exploration permit, we strongly encourage you to negotiate as part of your access agreement, your conduct and compensation agreement, that the company should conduct or pay for a baseline assessment to be carried out of on your bores prior to gaining access or prior to those activities taking place, and also as part of that process that you negotiate ongoing monitoring and testing of that bore. So not just a one-off assessment, but ongoing assessment. And this is where talking with your company representative and talking with experts within the Coal Seam Gas Compliance Unit to be able to look at, well, what is the preferred frequency? If the activities are lasting a number of years or whether the activities are purely exploration, the likelihood of potential risk should obviously be addressed in part of that frequency. Like the bottom table shows you, once a company moves into production or is granted a petroleum lease or production permit, the company has an obligation to undertake a baseline assessment of each private water bore within the tenure area. So if your property is covered underneath a production tenure, then a company must undertake a baseline assessment of that bore within that tenure area, and they're also required to provide you with minimum notification before that assessment will be undertaken, and obviously talk to you about the best timing to do that assessment, what they'll be doing as part of the assessment, whether they have to look at moving equipment or pumping equipment, obviously doing that in negotiation with yourself, and also being aware that they're required to provide you with a copy of that report within 30 days after that report has been completed. And we do strongly encourage you to seek a copy of that report for your own records, and obviously to make sure that you're aware of what that report indicates, you're aware of what that report is saying. And this is not putting the responsibility on you. This is the best way we see you address it is to have a conversation with the resource company representative, to sit down and ask them to take the time to explain to you the report findings and some of the information that's being contained within the report, but as well as obviously using the groundwater expertise within the groundwater assessment team as part of the CSG compliance unit, and using their expertise to explain that process to you. As part of that baseline assessment process and as part of that risk assessment process, the groundwater model also includes drawdown contours showing impacted areas, and obviously what it shows you is a more accurate impact of the true extent of the drawdown, for example. So the information contained within the globe will show you the ring contour drawdown, the extent of that drawdown, but the maps contained within the actual model will actually show you colour-coded level of impact, for example. So if you look at Chinchilla, for example, or Miles, for example, there are certainly areas within that predicted area that are looking into the long-term predicted impact of the industry, where some impacts or some drawdowns within the balloons are potentially going to exceed 100 to 200 to 300 metres. And obviously looking at the availability of your baseline assessment data, this is quite useful information to look at both part of the initial assessment, but also to look at bore monitoring programs and identifying that frequency of monitoring. One of the things that was raised on registering, obviously, is to ask. Some of you asked about the bore complaint process and what do you do if you think your bore is being impacted. Now, it's important to understand that regardless of being within or outside the long or the short-term affected area, your rights as landholders are the same within the cumulative model area. First of all, we recommend that you do raise the complaint or raise your concerns directly with the resource company that you're dealing with, or go directly to the coal seam gas compliance unit, and their details are at the bottom of this slide, and will be emailed along with the recorded version of this presentation. What the compliance unit may do is they may direct either the company, or EHP may direct the company to do an investigation, or the compliance unit may do an investigation themselves. If they confirm that the bore is being impacted as a result of CSG, then what they will do is they direct that a make-good agreement be required, and that as part of that make-good agreement process, that a suitable water supply or another arrangement such as financial compensation being negotiated as part of that process. So really this shows you that the process encompasses those bores or those landholders that have been proactively identified as being potentially impacted, but also those reactively indicating that your bore is being impacted. And it also shows the importance of doing baseline assessments to monitor any change and to start to see using a program such as CSG Net, if you start to see that within a 6-month or a 12-month period that there's a slow decline in pressure or quantity of water, or there's some sort of change occurring in your bore, then that should send alarm bells to you that there's something going on within that bore or within that aquifer, and that really you should be raising complaints to the company and to the compliance unit before that impact starts to create an emergency situation. Now, at the moment, there's a number of different reviews that are being conducted both into the Water Act, which Chapter 3 governs make-good requirements, as well as some other provisions that are before Parliament at the moment to actually give you, as landholders, some increased rights. One of the processes that is occurring, and I am aware we're almost out of time, is to look at developing a harmonised framework, as the department calls it, between the legislation governing CSG and the legislation governing mining. So there's a process that's looking at bringing in the requirement for cumulative models to be developed for large mining activities, as well as bring mining activities such as coal mining under the Chapter 3 Water Act process, which is developing these groundwater models and requiring a proactive and monitored make-good process rather than being reactive to impact. So this is a change or changes that have currently been discussed between Parliament and the department, and it is ongoing at this point of view, but we will certainly keep everybody aware of the developments of this process. And there are some changes that will result for both landholders and companies, and also some changes for gas companies. So there's no change in regards to gas companies being required to develop groundwater models and developing make-good arrangements, but there is requirements for, or putting a proposal for a requirement for CSG companies to obtain a water license, similar to any groundwater user, for non-associated water, which is water such as water that does not come from the process of extracting gas. So when you extract gas, you sometimes can bring water. That's associated water. When you're drilling a well purely for the purpose of extracting water, such as a bore, then that becomes non-associated water. So the requirement to give gas companies the requirement to obtain a water license may be included in those provisions, but these are ongoing at the moment. One of the important bills at the moment that is before Parliament and is actually due to be reported on today is the Environmental Protection and Underground Water Management and Other Legislation Amendment Bill, or EPOLA. What it does is it proposes some amendments to the Environmental Protection Act, so the overarching environmental legislation in Queensland, State Act, as well as the Water Act, which governs the Make Good framework. So the bill was referred to the Agriculture and Environment Parliamentary Committee, who were meant to report to Parliament by today, actually. Now, some of the key changes in this bill include looking at providing landholders with the ability to have a legislative right to be able to seek expert hydrogeological advice as part of make good agreements and negotiations, and making sure that that is a cost that is not borne by the landholder. So this is an important part that we have been pushing for many years now, to be able to give landholders the ability, as part of make good negotiations, to seek that hydrogeological expert advice to be able to give you the confidence and the assurance that the negotiations are correct, are progressing correctly, and give you some assurance around that groundwater supply. So hopefully a very strong positive for landholders. There's also looking at an ability for the make good framework to actually look at addressing the impacts from bores which may be impacted from the presence of free gas. So the issue obviously of gassy bores, of lowering water pressures or water heads within the aquifers is maybe having a resulting impact of free gas or gas migrating into landholder bores, and obviously that creating not only a health or environmental risk, but obviously potential a supply issue. So currently under the Make Good framework, that's falling between the process of how it's addressed, but this bill looks to amend the framework to give landholders and companies the confidence and ability to be able to address those impacts. It's also looking to develop an integrated dispute resolution process for make good negotiations, such as that seen for the land access framework, where there's a graduated dispute resolution process and minimum timeframes and ability for landholders and companies to use and access dispute resolution processes to resolve make good agreement conflicts. What it also is looking at doing is also looking at creating an increased assessment and modelling requirement on resource projects that look at just not only the predicted impact, but also the ongoing operational impacts. So requiring the development of proactive modelling before a project is approved or as part of approval, but also making sure that that process is ongoing throughout the duration of the activities. And some of the other things we'll look at, like I said, bringing in some transitional arrangements between mining and petroleum legislation to bring some consistency, as well as including a cooling off period for make good agreements. So developing a process for landholding companies to have a cooling off period once an agreement has been executed, to make sure that everything is covered and everything that is processed. There's also an amendment that will look to clarify what constitute make good obligations, and require that there is a make good agreement where there is a likelihood that the resource company created or contributed to that water supply, rather than creating rather than there having to be a proved certainty. So indicating that where there's a likelihood that the impact to your bore is coming from coal seam gas, that the water legislation be amended to make sure that that still requires a make good agreement. Some of the difficulty with groundwater investigations is, in the absence of certainty, the obligation may be pushed onto landholders to be able to prove that process. So this legislation is looking at making some more obligations a little bit clearer and providing some more clarity to landholders and companies about the likelihood and the responsibility of companies in that process. So while we looking in a bit of a summary of the presentation webinar this afternoon, some of the key points to take away is that the model, the 2016 model, has now been finalised as of September, and the landholders with those immediately affected bores should be approached, or should already have been approached, to develop those make-good agreements. It's important that you understand that landholders are entitled to be reimbursed for your necessary and reasonable legal, accounting and valuation costs that are incurred as part of that process. It's also important to be able to access tools such as the OGIA Groundwater Bore Search to view the impact areas on the CSG globe, as well as use those drawdown maps within the model. That we've discussed as landholders, you certainly should consider carrying out baseline assessments either yourselves, or you should approach the CSG compliance unit for information such as CSG Net, and that we strongly encourage you, as part of your land access negotiations, or those of you who have negotiated a land access agreement, to review those agreements to include baseline assessments and bore monitoring as part of that agreement. And anyone with any difficulty getting that process organised, are strongly encouraged to either contact the compliance unit or to contact the myself and the AgForce Projects CSG and mining team for assistance to be able to develop and integrate that into your agreements. I do apologise that we have gone slowly over time, but in terms of the content that I need to develop and present for this afternoon, that brings us to the close of this webinar this afternoon. If there are any questions or comments or feedback that any of the attendees would like to provide in the webinar, please feel free to pop them in the chat box, and I'm happy to answer any of those questions now. Or if there's no questions or comments, we're happy to close the webinar and end the recording. And please do feel free to either contact myself, and my details are on the webinar, and also to obviously contact the CSG compliance unit, and their contact details are on the webinar as well. Like I said, while I'm waiting for a few people to type in some questions, like I said, following the webinar this afternoon, there will be a recording of this webinar that will be collated by Redback Conferencing, our supplier, and we'll send that recording out to everybody that registered, and we had a great response to the webinar, over 80 people, and we'll be collating some of the questions and answers. So, you know, I certainly do appreciate there are a lot of there's a lot of information within this this topic that we weren't able to cover this afternoon in the time that we had. But what I'll be doing is I'll go through and I'll be providing a lot more comprehensive answers to some of your questions in that follow-up email. I'll be making sure that I send you links to the bore search portal, the CSG Globe, everything you have to do in terms of being able to access information about the model, where to download the model, and all the information that we will be providing with you as well. I'll also include the contact details for the compliance unit and the groundwater investigation team, as well as making sure that we provide you with some information about possible sources of commercial firms who might be able to provide you with some information about doing baseline assessments, and putting you in touch with people that are able to undertake and do those assessments on your behalf. So we'll be providing you with a list of people who can do that work for you, who can help, as well as a bunch of other questions and answers that may be able to help you with that process. So if there's no other questions coming through, again, thank you for your time this afternoon. I do appreciate you giving me your time to listen and participate in the webinar. I hope it was worthwhile, and we hope to see you at the next webinar. Thank you very much.